Hi, I'm Dana R. Fisher, and I'm climate punk because I bring data to power.
Great, Dana, to have you with us here today. How's your mood? Because I mean, you are a self-described apocalyptic optimist. I don't hear that a lot.
Apocalyptic optimist.
Exactly. So, is that sort of just because you're looking forward to apocalypse, kind of like a Christians looking forward to heaven, or what's the deal about that?
So the reason I call myself an apocalyptic optimist is because I do believe that we can save ourselves, but I believe that it also will come through the experience of the climate crisis. So we need to get to the point where everything gets quite a bit worse before people will mobilize and work together to bring about the systemic changes that are needed to get us to the other side of the climate crisis. So
I mean, yeah, you should be happy right now because it seems like things are going in your direction. I mean, we see rising climate activism. We do obviously see nature playing us all a trick these days. We have wildfires down in Texas, and we see our sort of planet a little bit out of balance. So one of the things, and why I really look forward to talking to you here today is, where does the solution come from? I mean, there's always this idea about, is it government, is it business, is it people? So what's your take? What's going to motivate people?
So I think that what I was talking about was, where do we think social change will come from? And what I do is, in my new book, I talk through and provide data from 25 years of research on climate policymaking and climate activism to review where we're coming from and where we're going. And I assess the ways that climate policymaking at the international as well as the nation state level around the world has really failed to get us where we need to go in terms of the systemic changes that are needed to address the climate crisis. And then I also talk about the ways that business interests have been bipolar. And what I mean by that is that some businesses are pushing very hard for a clean energy transition, while others are digging in their heels and doing everything they can to delay a transition to clean energy. We see that in the ways that many fossil fuel interests have been pushing for expanded energy extraction, fossil fuel extraction and expansion around the world. And so as a result, my expectation based on all of my research is that the way that social change will come is by social movements pushing for action from the outside in. And that is how we'll save ourselves.
Yes, one of the things that I was really curious about, sort of around the premise of your book, and I really love your data approach to all of this, but we are on the back of the pandemic. And this is, at least in my lifetime, the first time I saw a crisis create a mass shift in behaviors and, in some aspects, mindsets, which, going into this conversation, I thought quite a bit about and thought, maybe this is the opportunity, right? We saw in quite a few countries that the climate emissions went down. But then on the other hand, we're back at business as usual. Consumption is back. It's almost like we forgot the crisis was there. So do you think actually that this approach to crisis is enough? I mean, aren't we just sort of creatures of habits? We're just going to fall back and do what we always do.
Well, I think your point is absolutely true. And I actually talk in the book about the way that the COVID pandemic shows us the pathway forward, but also shows us the degree to which we need what I call a climate shock that is durable and severe enough that it pushes for systemic change that lasts. Because with COVID, what we saw was this feeling of risk that happened on a global perspective, on a global level, where individuals as well as institutions felt so concerned about the pandemic that they shut down borders. people stayed inside, everything like that happened. And that basically changed behaviors. And it also had these unintended climate consequences. In the case of the climate crisis, though, we're not where we need to be for people to feel that level of risk to change their behaviors. But what I talk about quite a bit in the book is the degree to which the shocks that we experience have to be so severe that they last. It can't just be a short-term, moment where people change their behaviors, because then we just bounce right back to business as usual. And that's what we learned from the COVID pandemic. So as a result, this is why I'm an apocalyptic optimist, right? Because I believe that we need to get pretty far down the crisis before enough people feel the level of risk needed to motivate the kinds of social changes that are required. And they're not going to be easy. I mean, we know this. We know that the transition away from fossil fuels is a very difficult process. It will affect us all. It'll affect the way that energy is produced and energy is consumed around the world. It will affect countries going through development, and the ways that they can develop, as well as how countries that are already developed will continue to prosper. So that is one of the reasons that this change will be slow, but it will have to come from the experience of risk and likely the experience of disaster in many places in the world.
I think it's such a fascinating and also a little bit scary premise that you put out there in the book, that we need the shock. We need to face climate crisis head on. And I think already, the last couple of years, we are seeing that more and more in the news. We see the death counts going up. So we are getting a little bit of that shock effect. Although, when I sort of look back at, my lifetime and the climate communication and that I've received, I kind of always feel that tactic has been the usual one, that, it's almost like they've always tried to shock me and to fall into line and believe in climate. So is shock really what's needed, or don't we need a bit of optimism? Don't we need to feel that there is light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, I think there's a difference between optimism and a sense of efficacy, right? I mean, and I am absolutely an optimist. I just have a realistic approach and perspective in terms of what we will need to get to the other side of the climate crisis. And when I say shock, I don't mean a short-term experience of disaster. I mean a long-term understanding that disasters will come more frequently and with more severity. And it is that level of risk that will be felt globally that can actually motivate enough people to join their brothers and sisters in the streets. Because right now what we're seeing is a small vanguard of a climate movement. But the climate movement is absolutely nowhere near a mass mobilization. And that kind of a mass mobilization that would be required to push for the types of really substantial social change coming from the business sector, from the state, in terms of the way that business is done in all countries. So the idea that could happen without there being a real experience of risk, shock, and pressure for social change is unfathomable. Because if that had been possible, as somebody who's been studying and engaging in the climate regime and working around climate policymaking for all of my adult life, after 25 years, I can tell you we're nowhere near, and we're nowhere closer to getting to where we need to go than we were before. And that's because there needs to be what we call the political will, right? It's not just that the technology needs to exist. There needs to be political will to change it. And given how much work will be required to get us there, the political will needs to be strong for this type of systemic change. And that's why my research shows that the only way forward is through shocks that motivate experiences of risk that push for social change from the bottom up.
Yeah, and I really sort of buy into the premise of the bottom up. I think the only thing we can expect from politicians is always let the priorities change every 4 to 5 years, depending on what country you're in. So it does seem like it's very, very difficult to safeguard any long-lasting change. And I mean, obviously, even the US is, I think, quite a good example of how you have shown leadership, then drawn back, then potentially gotten back into showing partly leadership on this agenda. But so in creating this bottom-up movement, I think one of the things I've always been curious about is that it's always been such a niche movement, which you also describe a little bit in your book, that it's been this sort of leftist agenda. But how do we open up for the wider public using your shock approach? I mean, obviously now the farmers in Texas can see that. They can see the distressed cattle. They can see it on the revenue, on the livelihood. Is that the sort of motivation you feel is going to make the Americans, the Indians, the Danes wake up?
I think that it is the personal experience of climate shocks and the effects of climate change that will do it. I think it'll have to be severe, and these examples you've given are great ones. I also think, though, that in the book I talk about how we will expand the movement and what individuals can do to help us save ourselves. Two of the suggestions have to do with people who want to be activists and engage in the movement. But the last one is really for everybody. And it's all about how we cultivate what I call resilience in communities, not just in terms of thinking through environmental resilience, that is making it so that in drought-prone areas, we are prepared for drought and can actually support the environment when drought hits, right? So that's this environmental resilience. There's lots of work around that. But it's also about social resilience, and that is about creating a social net for supporting people in our communities when these shocks hit, right? When there is drought, when there is wildfire, when there are extreme events, be they heat waves or massive storms, flooding, et cetera, and so forth. I mean, we know all of the types of climate events that we expect to experience. But our communities are not ready for that. And that is really about building resilience in the community. You don't need to be in a political or specific political orientation to want to create resilience in your community. You don't need to have a specific career or a specific leaning of any sort to care about making sure your community is prepared if people are unhoused from a disaster. But that kind of work is absolutely necessary because given everything the natural scientists are saying and where we are in terms of looking at our trajectory for global warming, as well as for the types of climate effects that we will see from the concentrations of carbon in our atmosphere, we all need to be prepared. And that's part of preparing ourselves.
Yeah, and I think the hard part that, and one of the key reasons why we also run Climate Punk is obviously to understand, we have some people on board. We know that are motivated, but we're lacking more than half the other planet. And I think especially the US is a really good or bad example of how climate can be politicized, whether it should be something that all of us could support, could back. But as we see right now, for example, in Europe, where we have farmers who feel vilified by the climate movement and the transition that I think we all know needs to happen, but they feel vilified, they feel not part of that movement. So how do you see resilience sort of inviting those people on board that are currently not feeling that the climate narrative is for them?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And I think that this is all about creating solidarity across interests and different social groups within society. In a lot of ways, fossil fuel interests, and I've documented this a lot in my work, and there are many other people who have done wonderful work on this subject. Fossil fuel interests have intentionally separated different folks away from one another based on their interests so that they feel like they are in conflict with one another. And that has been used as a tool to slow down progress towards a transition away from fossil fuels, right? To maintain the business as usual and the access to power and resources that fossil fuel interests currently have. So they make it seem like the farmers are against the people who care about the environment. And when it comes down to it, and as climate shocks start to hit at the local level, it will be very clear the ways that coalitions will have to form just to protect our communities. And it won't be about climate as much as about protecting our communities from disaster and from the effects of climate change, which is really not a political issue. It is a social issue, and it is about creating solidarity. One of the things that I think that the climate movement needs to do, but I think that movements in general and that labor needs to do, is they need to start thinking about how they can work together. We know that when identity is connected to movements, and this is from my research on social movements well beyond the climate movement, but we know when different identities are brought together and see the role that they can play in a coalition, the coalition is stronger and the outcome of the movement is stronger too. So thinking through solidarity between labor, between farmers, between interests that are environmentally embedded, as well as interests that are more focused on climate change as this kind of conservation perspective, it can happen and it will have to happen. And that will all come from everybody recognizing the way that the climate crisis will affect them and their personal interests, and how everybody has a common goal here. Because the common goal is, while it is about addressing the climate crisis, the common goal really is about saving ourselves, saving our communities, saving our people whom we care about, and trying to get to the other side of the climate crisis with as little pain and suffering as is possible. But right now we are set up. It's pretty obvious for a lot of pain and suffering to come, and the question is, how much can we limit it so that we work together to get to the other side faster?
And I think that is one of the key challenges, isn't it? I mean, the fact that people don't feel invited on board this life-saving mission, this community-saving mission, that people feel that it's a narrative that they're not part of. I mean, compared to another historical event, I think, when nations are faced with wars, that's typically what happens, is that you create a unified narrative around a villain or evil forces or something else that needs to be overcome. And then you rally societies, then you rally communities to step in and act on this. Why do you think that hasn't happened with climate change? And do you blame the early activism? When did that go wrong?
Well, I mean, so the challenge of the climate crisis is the fact that climate change is a slow disaster coming for us. It is not something like a war where a bomb is dropped and all of a sudden a country is at war and has to mobilize against a common enemy. I mean, that's what you're saying. And what you're talking about here is that movements are much more effective. Social change is much more possible when there is a perceived and understood common enemy.
Yeah, but we could have had that, right? I mean, I was one of the folks who got provoked into the climate movement because our failed leaders at COP15 in Copenhagen, Barack Obama, Tony Blair, Angela Merkel. I think our elected leaders could have taken on that sort of Churchill-like speech and saying, "This is our enemy."
They absolutely could have. I mean, but my takeaway from my experience at COP15 was quite different, in that what we did see is civil society pushing back, and then we saw these vested interests that have captured access to power and access to resources, holding tightly to their connections to power in these countries. And that is why we did not see all of our leaders decide to move forward and really be aggressive around the climate crisis, because there are these interests that are, were really hidden. And I think actually in Copenhagen was the first time that we started to see them. I mean, it was obvious this past year at the negotiations, where OPEC had their own little tent within the negotiations, so the quiet part is being said very clearly out loud now, pushing back against the idea of transitioning away from fossil fuels. But they were there from the beginning, and they were hidden, and they were, and as a result, the movements that did mobilize were not able to connect as well as they could have because they were being pushed against by these other interests. And that is the real challenge of the climate crisis is one, the effects of climate change are being experienced slowly in this like slow horror film that's coming for us, but we're not there yet. And two is that there are these vested interests that have tentacles all over power, and they have access that is pushing back in these, many of them extremely sneaky ways that we don't see through greenwashing, through redirecting concern away from systemic change and towards individual focus on our own individual consumption, which will absolutely not get us where we need to go. And it's about exposing these tentacles and then pushing back against them and recognizing them as a common enemy. But when those tentacles in the United States, they fund a lot of political campaigns on both sides of the aisle, and they are all over the American state. And you can see it in the fact that fossil fuel interests have subsidized access to natural resources that are owned by the American public. And that's not just happening in the United States. These kinds of subsidies exist all over the world. So those companies are empowered and given these privileged access to resources that makes it so that they're going to hold on as tightly as they can to their power and their access because that's how they make profits. And that's the common enemy. But finding a common enemy is within us makes it a slower process. And that's the process that has to happen before people can mobilize and push together as a unit.
Yeah, it's quite interesting you talk about in the book this notion that the individual is sort of trapped in a sort of rigged system where there isn't enough sort of wiggle room unless you want to go off the grid and live in a Swedish forest somewhere and be self-sustaining. But you talk about this idea that it's the collective activism that is going to drive that change. But aren't the collective activism, in fact, just faced with the exact same rigged system? Isn't it just the same? It's just more people sort of punching at the bag, but nothing is changing.
Well, I think at this point there is this sense of this Herculean task, right? To get enough people to push, for that metaphor you're using, to punch against the bag, but the bag starts to move, right? It is a huge process to try to mobilize enough support, which is why I talk about the need for a mass mobilization that can push back enough. Because it is only when the state starts to feel what we call a legitimation crisis, where it starts to worry that it's going to lose power, that it's going to change. Because right now, we've seen so many stories about the people in power who are benefiting and profiting from exploitation in ways that are making them rich, right? So how is that going to change without pushing back in a way that makes the people in power feel threatened? And I'm not saying violence. I'm saying there needs to be enough people that push back and say you're going to lose power unless you make the changes that are needed. But the idea that we can individually do that, you're right. We could all move. Those of us who have the capacity could move into the middle of the woods and live off the grid, but that's really your only other option. And, and hope that climate change doesn't come for you, although we know that it's coming for all of us. So we're going to have to work together. But that's again where we get to the apocalyptic part, because we're going to have to work together, and we're going to have to do it recognizing this common enemy. And the common enemy is going to show itself in the form of all these climate shocks that are coming more frequently and hitting us with more severity because of what we've done so far.
Yeah, and I think one of the messages I would love to get out here as well is, obviously there's a lot of people in our audience today who are thinking, wait a moment, but I want to act. So what should the individual do right now? How do we create that urge for mobilization? How do we create that bridge to those folks who you might not be agreeing with right now, or who live in the countryside, who live in a city, whatever it might be, who might not even live in the same country as us? How do we do that? What can the individual do? What's your message to him or her out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think that we need to think globally in terms of how we think about the climate crisis and the degree to which it is hitting people and countries in ways that are absolutely inconsistent. So there's not an equitable experience of the climate crisis for sure. And we know that developing countries that have contributed the least are going to be the ones that are hit the hardest first. So we need to think about that component of it and think about it globally. But at the same time, we really need to be working locally here, which means that phrase from the environmental movement from way back when, I think, is still very relevant here today. And when I say that we need to work locally, what I really mean is that we need to be creating solidarity and community by building networks and connections to people who care about stopping the climate crisis across different interests within our communities, so that we work across identity, work across interests, because we have a common interest here. So number one is to create community. Number two is to capitalize on what I call moral shocks and violence, which we will be seeing more and more of as activists mobilize to try to push against power. And I don't mean that there's going to be violence coming from the activists. I believe that we're going to see more and more violence against the activists. And that's just starting to happen around the world, where individuals who are trying to act and mobilize and push as part of movements are starting to be met with repression that is growing around the world. And that will continue to grow. And we see there's a big historical precedent for that. So we need to be prepared for that. And also, bear witness, because that's one of the ways also that we create solidarity, is by paying attention and standing up for and supporting our fellow, human being who is experiencing both climate shocks, but also repression when they are trying to speak out to power. And then finally is this point about cultivating resilience, like I said before. But again, I believe that to cultivate real resilience, although we need to work in sympathy and collaboration with people around the world, we really need to be embedded in our communities where we live, work, raise families, and have lives. If we only are connecting in ways virtually with other people who are concerned in other parts of the world, we're missing out on these thick connections and relational ties that can really provide support for one another as climate shocks come and as we need to push against power.
I think that was a really, really great summary of your core message of your book, and your idea about sort of including everyone into the movement. I think is something that I personally very much believe in as well. I think it's been a movement that's been quite exclusive for quite a bit of time. One thing we do every time for Climate Punk is we ask our audience to ask you a question using the hashtag #AskClimatePunk. And we have one actually very, very simple question to you, which I actually found quite interesting. So where did your interest in climate begin?
Well, okay. So I originally started thinking about, I started getting interested in the environment when I was in high school. So that was in the 1980s. So we weren't thinking about climate change necessarily then. While I was in university, I studied environmental studies. And that was, while I was in university, the Earth Summit happened in Rio, which is where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was originally born. So I came out of university wanting to do something around the environment and climate. And I came here to Washington, D.C. and started working on what we called the energy budget through the appropriations process, which was really wonky. And I learned so much about the way politics works in the United States that I didn't know before. But I also learned about how power is super entrenched, and just trying to support clean energy expansion, and this is in the early 90s, was so difficult. And there was so much entrenched efforts to stop both becoming more efficient in terms of energy consumption, but also in terms of transitioning to clean energy. And so my background really was about, environment and energy. And as the climate regime grew, I did different works in the nonprofit sector and then went back to graduate school just because I felt like I had been told in the different jobs I had that until I had my own PhD, I couldn't run my own project. So I really just went back to graduate school for an instrumental goal of getting, the letters at the end of my name so I was allowed to run my own projects. But while I was there, something crazy happened, and I really, I fell in love with social theory, and I realized how these kinds of big thoughts about the way the world works and the way society interacts helped me understand how we were actually going to solve the problems of our day. And, and at the time I wouldn't have thought of it this way, but the way that we can think about how we can save ourselves. And so I became a sociologist, and instead of being a sociologist who went back to work in clean energy and the environment climate sector, I ended up staying in academia. And I have spent, the past 25 years now writing books and doing research around climate policymaking and climate activism with the hope that the data that I developed and I collected and analyzed would help inform social change. And that's why I wrote the book Saving Ourselves, because it became really clear to me that just working within the academic community with the information that I was developing was not enough. I needed to get the message out to the general public. And that's why I wrote this book for the general public, for people to think through what we know from research, what we know from our collective knowledge so far about what is needed to get to the other side of the climate crisis. Because we don't have enough time for me to just continue working, through the IPCC, working within academia. We need to all work together at this point. And that's why I decided to go this direction.
I cross my fingers, and I'm sure the audience does as well, that you'll keep writing books and turning your data, your knowledge into something that can make us a little bit more informed on how we need to act on climate. That's unfortunately a wrap for this episode. I would love to keep talking and understanding more about your book, but obviously you in the audience, you have the big opportunity to obviously pick up Dana's book, Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action, in a library, from a bookstore, anyway near you. So thank you, Dana, for joining us. And to all of you climate punks out there, I hope you find your way to climate action.
Thank you.